70 years. That's how long we believe Neanderthals were a purely European phenomenon, a population that diverged 500,000 years ago, adapted to the cold, and vanished when our ancestors expanded out of Africa. Then, in 2026, a team of scientists in Morocco made a discovery that shattered the entire framework: a jawbone, 773,000 years old, time-stamped by Earth's magnetic field itself. And it rewrites the Neanderthal origin story from the ground up. Because the more we dig, the stranger the truth becomes. For most of the 20th century, human evolution was taught as a ladder. Homo erectus climbed to Homo heidelbergensis. Heidelbergensis split into two branches, one in Europe that became Neanderthals, one in Africa that became us. Clean, linear, separate. The story held together because it was simple. The fossils fit. The geography made sense. European Neanderthals stayed in their Ice Age refugia. African sapiens evolved in isolation. And then, around 50,000 years ago, we expanded out of Africa and replaced them. But between 2024 and 2026, 3 discoveries dismantled that model completely. The first came from a place called the Grotte Hominides, the Cave of Hominins, at Thomas Quarry 1, just outside Casablanca, Morocco. Excavations there had been ongoing for decades, but in 2026, researchers published something extraordinary. They'd found a mandible, a lower jawbone, cataloged as THI-GH-1, and they dated it to 773,000 years ago, plus or minus 4,000 years. Now, in paleontology, dates are usually fuzzy. Radiocarbon dating only works up to about 50,000 years. Beyond that, you're relying on volcanic ash layers or uranium decay, and the error bars get wide. A fossil dated to 500,000 years ago might actually be anywhere between 400,000 and 600,000. But Thomas Quarry is different. The researchers used a method called magnetostratigraphy. Here's how it works. Every so often, every few 100,000 years, Earth's magnetic field reverses. North becomes south. Compasses would point the wrong way. And when that flip happens, it leaves a signature in the rocks. Iron particles in sediment align with the magnetic field as they settle. So if you drill core samples through ancient lake beds or cave deposits, you can read the polarity like a barcode. Normal, reversed, normal, reversed. The last major flip happened 773,000 years ago. It's called the Brunhes-Matuyama reversal, and the Thomas Quarry Cave captured it perfectly. The researchers took 180 magnetostratigraphic samples, tracking the exact position where the polarity switched from reversed to normal. The transition itself took 8 to 11,000 years, a geological eye blink. And the hominin fossils, including that mandible, were found in sediments deposited right at the boundary. This isn't a guess. It's a geological timestamp, 773,000 years ago. Here's why that matters. Geneticists have been using molecular clocks tracking mutation rates in DNA2 estimate when different human lineages split apart, and they keep arriving at the same number for when modern humans and Neanderthals diverged. Somewhere between 765,000 and 550,000 years ago. The Thomas Quarry fossils sit exactly at that point. Not in Europe, in North Africa. When the team analyzed the morphology, the shape and structure, they used micro-CT scans to examine the enamel-dentine junction, the internal architecture of the teeth that doesn't get worn down by use. This is like reading the blueprint instead of looking at the finished building. And what they found was a hominin that didn't fit any known species. It wasn't Homo erectus. It lacked the specialized traits you see in Asian erectus fossils from Java or China. It wasn't Homo antecessor, the 800,000-year-old species from Spain, which already shows some Neanderthal-like features in the face. The Thomas Quarry hominins were more generalized, more basal. They look like what you'd expect the ancestor to look like before the split, before one branch started developing the heavy brow ridges, the mid-face prognathism, the barrel chest of classic Neanderthals. This fossil represents the root, the last common ancestor. Not Homo heidelbergensis from Heidelberg, Germany. Not some European stem group, a North African population that existed at the exact moment the lineages began to diverge. Some of them stayed in Africa and eventually became us. Others moved into Eurasia and became them. But if that ancestor was in Africa 773,000 years ago, what happened when that population spread into Europe? And why do the European fossils look so different? Jump forward to 430,000 years ago, northern Spain, the Atapuerca Mountains. Deep inside a cave system, there's a vertical shaft that drops 13 meters into darkness. And at the bottom, paleontologists found the remains of at least 28 individuals. Homo heidelbergensis, they called them. the textbook ancestor. But in 2014, researchers extracted nuclear DNA from one of the bones, and it revealed something unexpected. These weren't Homo heidelbergensis, or if they were, heidelbergensis was just an early Neanderthal. The nuclear genome placed them firmly on the Neanderthal branch, not the Denisovan branch, and definitely not ancestral to modern humans. These were Neanderthals, 430,000 years ago, already specializing, already diverging from their Denisovan cousins. But here's the problem. When researchers sequenced the mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down through the maternal line, it didn't match later Neanderthals. It was closer to Denisovans. Why would early Neanderthals have Denisovan-like mitochondrial DNA, but later Neanderthals have a completely different type? The leading hypothesis is gene flow. Sometime between 400,000 and 200,000 years ago, a pulse of modern humans, or proto-modern humans, migrated out of Africa and interbred with the Neanderthal population in Europe. Their offspring survived, and the new African-derived mitochondrial DNA spread through the population, completely replacing the old Denisovan-like version. This wasn't the out of Africa we learned about. This was earlier, quieter. But it shows that the boundaries between these groups were never walls. They were permeable membranes. Fast forward to 2024. Grat Mandrin, in the Rhône Valley of France. Excavators recovered skeletal remains of a Neanderthal male who lived sometime between 42 and 50,000 years ago. Late Neanderthal, classic period. You'd expect him to be genetically similar to other late Neanderthals from Croatia, Belgium, or Russia. The researchers named him Thorin, after the Dwarf King from Tolkien. And when they sequenced his genome, they discovered something that shouldn't have been possible. Thorin's lineage had split from the main European Neanderthal population 105,000 years ago. And for over 50,000 years, more than 2,000 generations, his population hadn't interbred with any other group. The genome showed high homozygosity. That means long stretches where both copies of a gene are identical, the signature of inbreeding within a small, isolated population. Thorin's ancestors had been mating among close relatives for millennia. But here's the strange part. He lived in the Rhône Valley, surrounded by other Neanderthal communities. There were groups in northern Spain, groups in Germany, groups in Italy, just a few hundred miles away. And yet, no genetic exchange. The closest genetic relative to Thorin wasn't from France, it was from Gibraltar. The Forbes' quarry specimen. This suggests that Thorin belonged to a distinct Mediterranean lineage, separate from the northern classic Neanderthals that we see in places like Vindija Cave in Croatia or the Altai Mountains in Siberia. The Neanderthals weren't a unified empire. They were an archipelago, disconnected islands of small populations, fragmented by geography, culture, or something else we don't yet understand. And that fragmentation made them vulnerable. Now, shift east. Denisova Cave, Siberia. In the 2010s, researchers found fragmentary remains of a mysterious hominin group, genetically distinct from both Neanderthals and modern humans. They called them Denisovans. But for years, we only had tiny scraps, a finger bone, a few teeth, a piece of skull, genomes, but no faces. Then, between 2024 and 2026, researchers sequenced a specimen called Denisova 25, a molar, 200,000 years old, the oldest high-coverage archaic human genome ever recovered. And it revealed that the Denisovans weren't one group. They were at least 3 separate lineages. Denisova 25 was genetically distinct from a later individual, Denisova 3, who lived around 65,000 years ago. That means the Altai region, this single cave, system saw multiple waves of Denisovan populations replacing each other over 150,000 years. One of these lineages contributed ancestry exclusively to modern Papuans and South Asians, meaning there was a separate Denisovan range somewhere in Southeast Asia that never mixed with the Siberian groups. But the most shocking discovery was deeper in the DNA. Denisova 25 carried genetic segments from a super-archaic population, a hominin lineage that had diverged from the main human family over 1 million years ago, likely closer to 2 million. The most probable candidate? Homo erectus, the species that first left Africa 1.6 million years ago and colonized Asia, from Java to China, persisting until at least 110,000 years ago. The Denisovans didn't replace erectus, they absorbed them. And about 15% of those super-archaic genetic regions eventually passed through Denisovans into modern humans. If you have ancestry from outside Africa, you carry fragments of DNA from hominins that walked out of the Rift Valley 2 million years ago. Ghosts, layered on ghosts, layered on ghosts. For 10 years, Denisovans were a genome without a body. We knew they existed. We knew they interbred with modern humans in Asia and Oceania, but we didn't know what they looked like. Then, in 2021, researchers re-examined a skull that had been found in Harbin, China in the 1930s. It had been sitting in a museum, labeled as Archaic Homo sapiens, or sometimes Asian Homo heidelbergensis, dated to roughly 146,000 years ago. They extracted proteins from the dental calculus ancient plaque stuck to the teeth and analyzed the amino acid sequences. And those sequences matched predictions from the Denisovan genome. Dragon Man was a Denisovan. The Harbin skull is massive, thick brow ridges, a broad, flat face, a brain case larger than most Neanderthals, distinct from modern humans, distinct from Neanderthals, but undeniably human. This confirmed that Denisovans were a widespread, morphologically diverse group ranging from the Siberian steppe to the Chinese subtropics, adapting to radically different environments. And it suggested that many of the fragmentary fossils scattered across Asia specimens like Dali, Jinyushan, or Shujiayao might actually be part of the Denisovan family. Here's where it gets personal. If you have ancestry from outside Africa, European, Asian, Indigenous, American, Oceanian, you carry Neanderthal DNA, which means you also carry traces of that super archaic ghost population, genes from Homo erectus that walked out of Africa 2 million years ago. Drop a comment. What percentage Neanderthal are you? Have you done a DNA test? And knowing this changes your understanding of what human means. Tell me how. In 2025, a team at Princeton, led by Joshua Akey, published a study that redefined the timeline of human-Neanderthal contact. They used an AI-powered tool called IBD Mixed Identity by Descent Mixture Analysis, which can detect segments of shared ancestry without needing a clean reference population. And what they found was astonishing. Contact didn't happen once. It happened at least 3 times, spanning 200,000 years. The first wave was the earliest. Early modern humans, or proto-modern humans, left Africa and encountered Neanderthals somewhere in the Near East. They interbred, but the offspring stayed with the Neanderthal groups. We know this because the Altai Neanderthal from Siberia carries about 6% modern human DNA in its genome. But modern humans living today carry no trace of this event. The genetic contribution went one way, into the Neanderthals, not out. A second pulse of interaction, probably in the Levant, modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria. Again, the genetic traces are faint. The third wave is the one we've known about, the major out-of-Africa migration. This is the event that introduced the 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA that exists in all non-African populations today. But here's the question. If modern humans and Neanderthals were meeting, mating, and producing fertile offspring 200,000 years ago, why did Neanderthals still exist 150,000 years later? The IBD mix analysis revealed something else. Much of the genetic diversity that researchers had attributed to Neanderthals was actually introgressed modern human DNA that came from us, not from them. When you correct for that, the effective breeding population of Neanderthals drops dramatically, from earlier estimates of 10 to 20,000 down to about 2,400 individuals. 2,400. That's smaller than many modern hunter-gatherer groups. Neanderthals didn't die out in a sudden catastrophe. They didn't lose a war. They weren't outcompeted for resources in a zero-sum game. They were genetically swamped. Over 200,000 years of periodic contact, the numerically superior modern human populations absorbed the smaller Neanderthal groups. Like a drop of dye dissolving into a bucket of water, the boundaries blurred. The populations merged. This is the assimilation model, and it's supported by the genomic evidence. When you look at the modern human genome, there are large regions, especially on the X chromosome, that are completely devoid of Neanderthal DNA. These archaic deserts exist because hybrid males were often infertile, a phenomenon called Haldane's rule. Natural selection purged those segments immediately. The genes that caused reproductive problems didn't survive, but other regions show the opposite pattern. Neanderthal variants related to immune function, especially resistance to RNA viruses like coronaviruses, were positively selected. Same with genes affecting skin pigmentation and hair texture. These weren't just neutral hitchhikers. They were adaptive advantages. Pre-adapted tools that modern humans acquired when they moved into Eurasia, helping them survive local pathogens and low UV environments. The Neanderthals gave us gifts, coded in DNA. So, where did the Neanderthals come from? The answer isn't a single location or a single moment. It's a process that unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years. It began with a population in North Africa, something like the Thomas Quarry hominins 773,000 years ago. That population split. Some stayed in Africa and eventually became the ancestors of Homo sapiens. Others moved into Eurasia. Over time, the Eurasian branch accumulated the traits we associate with Neanderthals: heavier brow ridges, mid-face prognathism, barrel chests adapted to cold climates. This wasn't instantaneous. It was gradual accretion features, added layer by layer across millennia. But those populations never fully isolated. Gene flow continued. Pulses from Africa brought new mitochondrial lineages. Interactions with super archaic groups like Homo erectus added ghost DNA. And starting at least 200,000 years ago, modern humans began mixing with Neanderthals repeatedly. The fragmentation groups, like Thorin, isolated for 50,000 years, made them vulnerable. Small populations are fragile. Inbreeding reduces genetic diversity. Climate shifts can wipe them out. And when waves of modern humans arrived, carrying larger population sizes and more diverse gene pools, the Neanderthal populations were absorbed. So what even is a Neanderthal? If they're part African, part super archaic ghost, and constantly mixing with modern humans, where do you draw the line? This is the debate splitting the field right now. Are Neanderthals a separate species, Homo neanderthalensis, that hybridized with Homo sapiens? Or were they a subspecies, a regional variant of a single, highly variable species that spanned 3 continents? The evidence increasingly points to the second option. 200,000 years of fertile hybrids. Continuous gene flow. No hard reproductive boundary. The family tree isn't a tree. It's a braided stream. Lineages split, reconnect, split again. There are gaps. Critical gaps. We need more ancient African genomes from between 500,000 and 800,000 years ago. That's the period when the split was happening. Right now, we're inferring the process from the endpoint. We need Denisovan fossils from Southeast Asia, where that third lineage lived. Dragon Man opened the door, but there are probably dozens of misidentified specimens sitting in collections across China, Indonesia, and the Philippines. We need earlier modern human fossils from outside Africa, evidence of those pre-200,000 year ago excursions into Eurasia. And we need super archaic fossils with extractable DNA. If we could sequence Homo erectus from Java or China, we could confirm whether they're the ghost population. Those discoveries would change the story again. They always do. The Neanderthals didn't vanish. They didn't lose. They dissolved into us carried forward in the immune systems that fight our viruses, the skin that shields us from northern winters, and the 3% of our genome that still remembers a cave in Siberia, a valley in France, and a coastline in Morocco where the story began. 773,000 years ago, a population stood at a crossroads. Some stayed in Africa and became us. Others walked into Eurasia and became them. But the boundary was never a wall. It was a permeable membrane. And now, as we read the book written in bone and blood, we're learning the truth. There was never a moment when we were separate. We were always braided together. If this changed how you see human evolution, from a ladder to a web hit subscribe, because this story isn't over. In 2027, scientists will publish the first complete genome from a Homo naledi specimen. And if you think the Neanderthal story is complicated, wait until you see what those bones are hiding. Next video, we're going to South Africa,